Thank you. I think I'll get us started here. Allison and I are both from actually all four of us today are going to be hailing from the Buffalo office. So welcome. Thanks for joining us. Allison and I are going to start talking about some labor and employment matters. There's a lot that we could choose from. We chose sort of four distinct topics because these topics are what I would describe as sort of low-hanging fruit that apply regardless of the structure or size of your particular practice. These are concepts that would apply to everyone, and they're things that give us an opportunity to talk about some broader issues. After that, we're going to turn it over to Jessica and Mario to talk about AI issues that may be affecting your practice or that you may want to leverage for the sake of your practice. Next slide, please. So as I said, we're going to talk about four issues on the labor and employment side today. These are those issues. Again, some of them will sort of branch out and enable us to talk about some broader concepts, but these are the basics. So next slide, please. First thing I'm going to talk about is employee handbooks, and we'll talk about some of the contents of those handbooks as well, to give you a little bit greater understanding of why some of these things we're recommending some of these things be in the handbook, why we recommend you have a handbook, and what they mean. So why do you have a handbook? And when we talk about handbooks, I just want to be clear, it's not always sort of an actual book or even a single PDF document these days. Many times it's merely sort of a policy and procedure library, something that maybe you have on your website, or internet, that has links to various policies. I do think it's good to have everything sort of in one place, so an employee wouldn't have to go searching around looking for something. Also, when you onboard an employee, generally you want to have them acknowledge that they've reviewed your policies, whether it be a handbook or your policy library, and they understand, acknowledge that they will abide by those policies and that they have reviewed them and they understand what things mean. Generally, the purpose of a handbook is to again summarize all your policies. You want to make sure that you do so. You're communicating to an audience. The audience is all of your employees. From your physicians to receptionists to everybody in between. So you want to make sure you communicate in clear, simple language that everybody can understand. You don't want to get into an argument over, yeah, whether this word or that word, what a word means or what a phrase means in a handbook. You want it to be fairly simple and easily understood by everybody. Many of the policies are going to be required by law. Unfortunately, sometimes those are the ones that are going to be worded the most unclear because of the way that the law requires us or suggests. The guidance in New York State often will suggest certain language that we use, which can kind of be a little confusing sometimes. But to the extent that we can simplify that, we will. Next slide, please. So these are a few of them. I'm going to talk about many of these issues individually, but here's just a basic list. It doesn't include everything. This is not exhaustive. This isn't everything that you should have in your handbook, but these are sort of some high points that we would recommend in pretty much every employer's handbook, regardless again of the size or characteristics of your individual practice. Next slide, please. So what do we mean by reservation of rights? Essentially, you're saying just because the handbook says on October 10th, 2024, it says one thing, doesn't mean that we can't change it the next day if the needs of the employer change, if the laws underlying them change, the provisions change, if you get a new benefits policy and you need to change it, you can always change those things. You want to make sure you're very clear about that so that employees understand and even expect that there will be changes to the handbook over time. There will be changes to the policies over time. Generally, you want to publicize that when you do make particularly material significant changes so that employees understand, what rules apply. Also, you want to make sure that you can, add things to as new needs arise. We're in a heavily regulated environment. I want to make sure when something new comes down, we can we can add that in to our ever-growing group of policies that we call the handbook. Next slide, please. So many of these, you want to make sure you have clear statements of non-discrimination, non-harassment, non-retaliation that clearly define all of the protected categories that apply. We're talking mostly in New York State here, but it could be federal as well. Or if you operate in additional jurisdictions, you want to make sure that you're incorporating all of the protected characteristics that would be protected by law in your jurisdiction. And if you have policy-based characteristics that you're going to protect, for instance, several years ago, transgender individuals were not specifically protected. Now they are, but even before that, many employers had policies that would protect those individuals. So you want to make sure you include all the protected categories, both under law and under your individual employer policies, and make clear statements about what type of conduct is prohibited. Next slide, please. Harassment, we want to make sure we're defining. Harassment is a term that gets thrown around a lot here. We're talking primarily about unlawful employment-based harassment. So material changes, decisions, hostile work environment that's been created based upon somebody's either participation in protected activity or their individual characteristics, whether that be race, gender, etc. We want to make sure that we're explaining what constitutes harassment, what constitutes a hostile environment. We're telling employees where they can go to report that. We're telling them what's going to happen if they go to report that. We want to make sure they understand they're not going to be retaliated against. There's going to be a process that's going to be followed. At the same time, we're not just going to sort of take what they give us and immediately act upon it, in terms of firing or disciplining a coworker, that kind of thing. We're going to do an investigation. We're going to determine whether, based upon our policies and our standards, whether there's been a violation. If so, what's going to happen? Next slide, please. All right, leave policies. We got a lot of leave policies. This is another area that sort of seems to grow by the year or even sooner. This is again a non-exhaustive list of protected leaves that you would want to make sure that you include in your handbook or in your policies that explain when these leaves apply, how they interact with each other. For instance, many times FMLA leave provides leave for employees, but it's unpaid, but they may be able to obtain supplemental wage replacement through disability leave or PFL leave, one of these other forms of leave. So you want to make sure you discuss the interplay between these various types of leave, whether an accommodation it can be a leave. And then if you have specific employer-based leave like sick leave or vacation pay, those kinds of things, that you're setting those forth clearly. Those are very important to include in the handbook so that employees have a clear understanding of what their rights and their benefits are. Next slide, please. Reasonable accommodations, basically we're talking primarily about disability, but it could also be religious-based accommodations that are being requested by employees. We want to make sure we're setting forth clear post-employment accommodations. So there are really two forms here. One is if an employee, or I should say a prospective employee, needs an accommodation during the application and hiring process. We want to state that in one place, make sure that whether that be on your employment application or somewhere like that, that you're giving employees or potential employees an opportunity to ask for accommodations during the hiring process. After hiring, then when we're onboarding, we're going to ask about whether employees need disability-related accommodations. I should have mentioned pregnancy accommodate would be another potential type of accommodation for pregnancy and related conditions. So I want to make sure we're telling employees what their rights are in this area and how to utilize those rights. Who do they talk to? What does the process look like? You want to make sure you document that as much for your employee or as much for your managers as for your employees, so that they understand, what they need to be ready to do when an employee comes to them seeking a disability or other related reasonable accommodation. Next slide, please. Substance abuse policy. The big one here is that you're going to make sure that you state what is prohibited. And 99 employers out of 100, maybe more, are going to prohibit any use of drugs or alcohol, including cannabis and cannabinoid containing products during working hours. Generally, you can prohibit use of drugs at any time, use of unlawful drugs, I should say. But things like alcohol and cannabis can only be prohibited. The employee can't be under the influence during working hours or on-call hours as they may be required. Next slide, please. So again, handbooks are not a one size fits all. The many of the things we're talking about today are one size fits all because they're things that are required or strongly recommended to be included in the handbook. But you can include other things as well. You want to make sure that your handbook sort of reflects the culture that you're trying to create within your office. If you have things that have happened in the past, this is something we always recommend. If you have issues that have arisen with employees in the past in your workplace, think about, should I have a policy to address that so that we don't, we learn from the past, we learn from our past mistakes or past issues that have occurred, and we get better. So think about incorporating additional things based upon your past experiences as an employer into your handbook going forward. Next slide, please. All right, grievance procedures. This is something that could be included in your handbook. It could be someplace else. But the next slide, please. The basic idea here is that you have, and Allison's going to talk about some more specific related types of grievance procedures around discrimination and things like that. But this is really just to suggest that you have an outlet, a constructive outlet for employees to bring forward concerns, suggestions, issues that they're facing in the workplace. And they're coming to you in a good, again, a constructive, semi-formal sort of way so that you can deal with things and address them before they sort of spiral out of control. You don't want people just complaining in the workplace. It's also helpful if you do have sort of a complainer in the workplace or several of them, or there's gossiping, that kind of thing going on. You can say, listen, if you have an issue, here's where you go to it. Here's where you go to solve that. And it may not always be your supervisor. Sometimes you want to provide additional outlets like human resources or compliance if somebody feels uncomfortable going to their supervisor. Usually that happens when they're complaining about their supervisor. Next slide, please. And now I'm going to pass it off to Allison. Thank you, everybody.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Seth. Good afternoon. As Seth mentioned, my name is Allison Roach, and I'm a labor and employment attorney in Bond's Buffalo office. And I'll be discussing our last two topics, at least for the labor and employment section, which are employee performance evaluations and then responding to legal and administrative complaints. Next slide, please. So now we'll be discussing some elements of performance management and why it's so important. So while many employment relationships are at will by default, obviously employers cannot terminate an employee for an illegal reason. So below you'll see here a non-exhaustive list of these protected classes. And then of course you cannot terminate an employee on the basis of one of these protected classes. Next slide, please, Sophie. So we want to talk today about employee evaluations and why they're so important from a performance management standpoint. So an evaluation is a learning tool for the employee, and then employers will be bound by what they say in an evaluation. So you want to make sure that what you're saying in any kind of employee evaluation is accurate and specific. It's important to remember that sugarcoating evaluations is counterproductive to both the business and the employee. And if you're allowing employees to get away with inappropriate conduct or poor work performance, that can really impact morale of the company as a whole and affect business operations. And it really it's not helping the employee or the business. It's really a waste of time for everyone involved if someone is struggling and the employer is not, identifying areas of improvement. So these kinds of employee evaluations should be frequent and consistent, either annual or every 6 months. And it's just important to be honest and specific in these evaluations. And you want to, explain your concerns and any shortcomings with specificity. Next slide, please, Sophie. So, the evaluations should be honest. So, sometimes we see where employers will just kind of give satisfactory ratings to employees across the board, and we really recommend against that. You really want to evaluate each employee specifically and give them feedback that impacts them. So with that being said, it's also important not to exaggerate or generalize during these performance evaluations. I've said it before and I'm going to say it again, but specificity is critical in these kind of evaluations. You want to give your feedback in an accurate and in candid manner, and then just obviously be specific. And it's just important to give examples or have support for any narratives of performance issues. You basically want the employee to fully understand, your issues with them, and then just room for improvement moving forward. Um, so likewise, if an employee's performance does begin to deteriorate, it's really important to create documentation of that and then also present it to the employee. So we'll talk about documentation a little later, but that it's just critical to document instances of poor performance. And as we have here on the slide, warnings are the key to litigation success. So you can just imagine jurors are more apt to believe that the employer was acting in a fair manner if they can see that there's sort of like a pattern of the employee being warned of performance issues. Next slide, please, Sophie. So how do you evaluate a struggling employee? So in situations where an employee's performance would require noticeable improvement to stay employed, it's really important to specify the expected improvement and then also the consequences of failing to meet that expectation, whether that is, as we'll discuss later, some kind of progressive discipline, or whether that is, termination at the next incident of something like that happening. Again, you're going to want to include areas for improvement, even when an overall assessment is good, and you're just going to want to outline future goals and expectations. Again, you just really want to make sure that the performance evaluation is accurately and specifically painting a picture of what is going on with the employee. Next slide, please. Okay, so progressive discipline is a tool that's used to correct employee performance issues. So progressive discipline, it's designed to provide a structured corrective action process, which is meant to improve and prevent a recurrence of undesirable employee behavior and performance issues. And examples of progressive discipline may include multiple types of warnings, like a verbal warning, written warning, final warning, and then, of course, performance improvement plans. Next slide, please, Sophie. So employment documentation is critical in any sort of performance management context. As you might imagine, this kind of documentation greatly enhances employer credibility in legal and administrative proceedings. And really, everyone expects that employers will keep good records and be able to produce those records if there's an issue about actions that were taken and the reason for the actions. And really, also, the reason is that even if you think that you might remember very clearly, in a couple of years, that might not be the case, or you might have forgotten something, or the employee might lie, or something like that. So it's just really important to have robust documentation whenever you're handling performance management issues. Next slide, please. So what should be documented? Well, in order to defend employment decisions, employers should have documentation that shows how and when the employee was put on notice of the employer's expectations and the consequences of not meeting them. So as we discussed, that's, these performance evaluations or past emails or discussions with managers and supervisors. And then you want to show that there was a fair and objective investigation. And so again, that would just be showing documentation, showing, these are the steps that I took to investigate this, and perhaps like a team of decision makers making some kind of disciplinary decisions. You can show, an adequate performance or misconduct, documentation of that. And then it's also critical to be able to show that the employer has treated similarly situated employees in a similar manner. And then likewise, that the discipline imposed is reasonably related to the seriousness of the offense and the employee's past record. So if you have an employee that's, if there is a situation where you've treated an employee differently, you want to be able to show, why that is the case. Next slide, please. Okay, so responding to legal and administrative complaints. Finally, we're going to cover how to respond when and if your practice receives a legal or administrative complaint. Next slide, please, Sophie. So, what is the best way to reduce the risks of discrimination claims in general? The most important tenet is, as we've been discussing, is to treat all employees equally. So it's really important to consistently apply policies and rules in the workplace. And if you need to make a deviation, it's just important to make sure that there is a good and objective reason for making that deviation. Second, as I just discussed for several minutes, it's really important to practice effective performance management. So if you have an employee who's struggling, it's much better to address the problem, even if it's awkward. And again, it's really better for both you and the employee to give them a chance to improve or cut ties. Third, and this really ties both of these previous 2 points together, make sure that you consistently follow your disciplinary policies and procedures. So if you're disciplining an employee for time and attendance issues, you should also be disciplining other employees who are having the same timeliness issues. So just, make sure that any kind of disciplinary policies are followed across the board and are not just targeted at certain individuals. So finally, as we've also discussed at length today, please make sure that you're documenting whenever and wherever possible. As we've discussed, documentation is the best way to tell the employer side of the story and just generally enhance credibility. Next slide, please. So what do you do if you receive a legal or administrative complaint? First, take a deep breath. We know that receiving any kind of complaint is just inherently stressful, but please, please, please do not procrastinate responding to the complaint. Immediately reach out to and engage legal counsel. The stakes here when receiving an legal or administrative complaint can be very high. So please do not attempt to handle any responses on your own. And just in general, the sooner you can involve legal counsel in any issues involving employees or employee management or a potentially litigious employee, the better. Next slide, please. We'll turn it over to Jessica and Mario, but if we have questions at the end, we're happy to answer them. So next slide, please. And now I'd like to turn the presentation over to my colleagues, Jessica Copeland and Mario Ayub, who are going to be presenting on artificial intelligence in healthcare.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Seth. And thank you all for spending your lunch hour with us. Like Allison said, we are going to be discussing different artificial intelligence applications in the healthcare space. Jessica and I are both members of the AI practice group and our cybersecurity practice group, and Jessica chairs both groups. Next slide, please. So a little bit of an overview of what we were hoping to cover today. So just a quick intro to artificial intelligence, go through some of the key terms, some of which you are probably familiar with, just to get a good basis of the rest of our discussion. Then we'll go through some common risks associated with AI use, and then talk specifically about AI use in a healthcare setting, practical use examples, different software that's available right now. And then finally, we'll end with how to implement these tools safely into your practice, what sorts of considerations that you need to pay attention to when you're looking at different products that are out there in the market. And hopefully you come away with this with a better understanding of how these tools can help you, how they can hurt you if you don't use them correctly, and how to deploy them safely across your practice. Next slide, please. So starting very basic, what is artificial intelligence? I think with the rise of ChatGPT and other types of generative AI programs, a lot of us are familiar, at least with some of the basic terms, but I wanted to pull out a few here for our discussion. So at its most basic form, AI simulates human intelligence by leveraging large quantities of data and computer processing power to make decisions and can respond to various prompts based on the data it has to access and the prompts that the user gives. So at the that's the very, very bare bones definition of AI. I'm sure you've seen some of these other definitions below on this slide. We'll go through them quickly. So machine learning is one of the earlier implementations of AI technology, and we've been using this for years. So these are supervised models that are designed to adapt to new additions to structured data sets and user inputs. And by structured data sets, all I mean is the program knows what type of data it's going to receive. So there are in contrast to programs that can ingest all sorts of content, these algorithms are more limited in their functionality, and they're expecting to see certain pieces of data come through. So a good example of this would be an Amazon product suggestion or a Netflix or YouTube video recommendation. The algorithm knows that it's going to receive certain data, what product someone clicks on, what show someone's watching. And then from there, it can provide recommendations based on history of other users, based on data it has access to make recommendations. So that's the most AI in some of its most basic forms. Then we get into deep learning, and this is a more advanced subset of machine learning. So it doesn't need to necessarily rely on structured data, expected data, although it certainly can handle it. But deep learning allows an AI model to ingest pretty much any sort of content. So a good example of this would be Google's reverse photo search. So you can upload a photo, maybe of a tree. I know Apple actually just came out with a plant identifying tool, which is kind of fun to use. But you put in this an image, and the algorithm is able to detect the content of the image. It doesn't have to be presented in any specific way, and then it can provide you with results. So it's a little bit more nuanced with the types of data that it can handle when making recommendations to the user. And then generative AI, which is a subset of deep learning, and this is something we're going to spend a lot of time talking about. I will say that the tools we're going to identify in the rest of this presentation, some of them have generative AI components, some of them do not. But even aside from the specific medical tools that we'll be talking about today, plenty of businesses, regardless of the industry, are starting to implement generative AI in their back-end processes to improve efficiency. So this could be anything from ChatGPT to generate images, text, blog posts, or advertising content, to schedule management, to email marketing campaign management, or managing your contacts, recommending when you should reach out to specific patients or individuals. Those are types of things that generative AI is helping us do right now. Next slide, please. So again, very briefly, artificial intelligence will look at a vast quantity of data, learn patterns, detect patterns. This is particularly relevant to models that are trained to detect disease or illness or symptoms. They're looking for specific patterns and relationships within the data, whatever that data might be. The model will extrapolate based on these identified trends and patterns to make predictions, and then these predictions can be leveraged by users to perform specific tasks, like to identify a treatment path or a comprehensive care plan for a patient. It really depends on the task that you present to the model. Next slide, please. So again, some common tools that you've probably seen out in the wild. ChatGPT is probably the most popular generative AI tool right now. It's used in almost every industry for a variety of different content generation tasks, as well as productivity tasks. Elon Musk and his X platform has developed its own proprietary algorithm, which draws directly from social media data, which is interesting when we get to talking about risks, because it will ingest anything really that is out there on the platform. So you have this concern now with what types of data is your model getting, how accurate is it, and what does the output look like in relation to the data that goes in. That's now commercially available to any X user. DALL-E is an image generation software you can use for all sorts of different applications, marketing, website design, things like that. And then Google Gemini, which is Google's answer to ChatGPT, and there's also Copilot, which is Microsoft's answer to ChatGPT. So there's plenty of options out here, and many of them are available for free or for very low cost. Next slide, please. So before we dig into specific applications in the healthcare industry and how you can leverage AI in your practices, it's good to start with an idea of what types of risks are involved with using this technology. And this is not to scare anyone away from using it. Certainly, we're moving in the direction of most businesses are trying to capture some of the efficiency and some of the cost-saving benefits that AI provides. But we do need to stay mindful of certain risks that might arise while you are using these products. So number one here is accuracy. is the model producing reliable results? And often that's not a very easy question to answer, especially when you are using a third-party tool or you've licensed software from another developer for your practice, and you're not necessarily sure how it manipulates data and how it generates output. There's been a couple of recent studies that have shown that ChatGPT's answers to the same prompt given in a different time period, maybe a month later or a week later, can produce vastly different outcomes, vastly different output. And that raises a lot of questions about the reliability of these generative AI programs. They are trained to give you an answer, not necessarily to give you the right answer. So there's always a concern that the output needs to be reviewed by an actual human, fact-checked, and that's something you'll hear us say a lot. You cannot take any of the output at face value. You really need to verify the content that comes out of these programs, regardless of the application. And then related to that is bias. Is the model desperately impacting an individual protected class or group in a different way? There was a recent Yale study that actually looked at an algorithm for a diagnoses and treatment model and found that minority patients had to show many more comorbidities, many more symptoms to be recommended the same treatment as a white patient, for example. And while the model might be working accurately with the data it's provided, the underlying data might have been collected in a way where it is carrying forward a bias from the data collection into the output of the system. So one example they gave for an explanation for this disparity is typically minority groups have decreased access to healthcare, and it's all the AI model is doing is reading that data accurately, but the recommendations that are coming from it carry this bias with it. So accuracy and bias closely related, but there are some different considerations for each one to watch out for. Then transparency or the lack of transparency. The reason that's on here is a lot of the laws that are starting to develop in the states across the US are really emphasizing the need for regulators to be able to understand how your model works and how it interacts with data, so it can guard against some of these other risks like accuracy and bias. So right now we are trying to encourage all of our clients to fully understand the tools that they're using. So if you're developing a tool in-house, make sure you have documentation available that a layperson can read, not someone with a computer science degree can read, that can really explain how it works, how the model manipulates data, how it weighs certain data over others. You really need to be able to explain that. And if you're licensing a software from a third-party vendor, you have to ask questions during the contract negotiation process about how does your model work. They are required to give you at least some information how their software manipulates your data, so that when a regulator comes knocking and asks how you're using it, you can give a complete and honest answer. So it doesn't really matter whether you're developing it in-house or whether you're relying on a third party for an AI tool. You have to have some understanding of how it works, just based on the legal landscape of these laws that are starting to develop. And then, of course, privacy issues come into play here. We have vast troves of protected health information stored on servers all over the place, whether you store that on premise or you have a third-party cloud provider. Because of the vast store of data that is required to power these models, you're going to have to retain, or a third party is going to have to retain, a large quantity of data. And one of the interesting developments coming from these new AI laws is a pretty clear mandate that you cannot just simply repurpose data that you already have to power these models. You have to obtain new consent from the patients to use it in a different way. And there's a temptation for a lot of large groups, a lot of large entities to want to leverage their existing data sets to power new applications. But that's not going to fly in many states, and you will need a new consent mechanism to alert a patient, we're going to be using this software as part of your treatment. You need to indicate your consent and understanding of these terms and how we're going to use it. So we'll see privacy issues start to crop up as more of these tools become available. And then security. Again, large troves of data. That is a very attractive premise for a bad actor who wants to steal sensitive data that might have value on the black market. We've seen healthcare companies targeted by ransomware attacks repeatedly. It's one of the most attacked industries, healthcare, just given the sensitivity of the data. So in order to power these models, you have to have the data, but you have to be able to protect it. And that includes administrative, physical, and technical safeguards. So having the proper policies in place to govern who can access the data at what time, how do you respond to an incident if a breach occurs, physical access controls on server rooms or buildings that have PHI stored on different mediums, and then technical safeguards such as is the channels that the data is flowing to the model, are those encrypted, password protected? Do you have all the necessary tools in place to back up this data? There are a lot of security considerations to consider. Even if you're outsourcing the tool to a vendor, you need to make sure that your vendor that you're working with, service provider, has some of these basic security measures in place. So with that, I didn't mean to scare anybody off from using these tools. It's just something we all need to keep in mind as we go through it. But I'm going to turn it over to Jessica now, who's going to talk in a little bit more detail about specific applications for the healthcare industry.
Thanks, Mario. And to all of those who don't know me, Jessica Copeland, thank you for spending some time here today. And I have to say it, go Bills. Apologies if there's any Jets fan on the line. We'll see you Monday. Anyway, so as Mario said, the point of identifying risks associated with AI tools is just so that you can make an informed and educated decision as to how much you want to rely on certain tools in your practice and your business. And we should also point out that artificial intelligence is not new. We've been relying on this technology for decades, and why we're all talking about it now is the launch of generative AI a couple of years ago. And that is an advancement in what we've been relying on from a technological perspective. And with that advancement created additional risks and concerns with utilizing such tools. So for background purposes, it's important to know that the FDA has already approved 900 AI-enabled medical devices and tools or solutions. And that is because the technology embedded in artificial intelligence allows for advancements in analysis of data and decision-making capabilities. So one example is preventative care, and how AI tools can assist a healthcare provider to understand these day-to-day patterns that you might be identifying as a human, but certainly a computer that can analyze hundreds, if not thousands, of anonymized patient data may be able to extract a pattern that you might not see based on the number of patients that come across your office. And then in pattern recognition, you might be able to identify, or the tool would be able to identify certain risks of a developing condition or detecting a condition that could deteriorate your lifestyle in some way. The advancements in AI have also allowed for early detection, and we see that most in early detection in cancer patients. So having the ability to, again, analyze troves of data, recognize patterns, recognize maybe a development in a cell growth, the DNA patterns of certain cancer patients. And I'm not going to go into your wheelhouse as physicians, that would be wrong, but there's just so much information that can be gathered by analyzing patient information that these tools are doing. And then another piece of early detection that we may all be familiar with is just the wearable AI-powered devices, such as your smartphone or your mobile device that is tracking your heart rhythm and maybe recognizing that there's a reason to go to see your cardiologist. Next slide. So AI use in healthcare continues with diagnosis tools. AI tools can leverage those large quantities of data, and it makes fairly accurate diagnosis. Certainly, Mario talked about the risk of inaccuracies, and having a human eye on the studies and analyses is important, but the AI tools will identify anomalies in images, and then identify trends in patient data that could link symptoms to potential conditions. And so the way the tool would work is learning from past cases. It can look to improve diagnostic accuracy over time. Other uses are in the treatment. So aside from the preventative facets of using AI tools, you can use those tools that would recommend a comprehensive treatment plan for certain patients that have chronic diseases, and it might be able to identify and coordinate the type of specialists that your patients could then go to for continued managed care. AI tools also have the ability to repurpose the existing drugs for rare diseases that have no known treatments. And then end-of-life care. So AI tools have been used as prompts or alerts to aid clinicians in deciding whether and when to discuss end-of-life planning. There was a recent UPenn study that found AI-assisted end-of-life intervention had reduced the mean daily healthcare spending at the end of a patient's life. Next slide. Some tools that you may be familiar with or may not have heard of, Luminetics Core. So this is after a retinal camera captures your images, the tool will use an AI-based algorithm that can separate diagnostic algorithm to detect and analyze biomarkers. It would provide diagnosis at the same appointment so that patients would be able to leave with a referral to an ophthalmologist. Then there's also a bridge, which as long as you obtain patient consent, the tool would record interactions that create a transcript in real time. And then that algorithm would identify pieces of information to draft the clinical notes, and providers would review those notes to make sure they're accurate. Next slide. Some additional tools, Wobot, it's a mental health chatbot that would use machine learning to understand how the patient's messages are written and then delivers a pre-written response. It would reply that with content that's created by Wobot's team of clinicians. So again, the type of data that is entered into these AI tools is important for the output. VBrain, so this speeds up brain contouring about 30%. And it improves contouring accuracy by 12% with manual contouring. So the FDA-approved deep learning algorithm will detect 3 most common types of brain tumors. And then GI Genius is, it draws on deep learning algorithms and analyzes and makes predictions about that unstructured data set, which would include images. And then there was a 2020 study that this tool increased the adenoma, which is a precancerous polyp detection rate by 14%. And then the colorectal cancer risk dropped 3% for every 1% increase in ADR. Very, very impressive tool. Next slide. All right, so now this is probably the most important facet of our presentation, where we're going to talk about how to look at these AI tools and responsibly implement them into your practice. So Mario, feel free to jump in. This is really part of a conversation. If we were in person, we'd be asking you all questions, but we're in the webinar setting. So if we have an in-person presentation, please join us in our office. But for now, so you want to identify what areas of your practice would benefit from implementation of AI. And Mario and I have tried to guide our clients in all industries to recognize what those areas of practice or business are, because you don't want to just wholesale adopt every tool that comes past your door. And let me tell you, there are probably thousands of AI vendors out there, you know, with advanced technology, but not all are necessary or required for running your practice. Mario?
I'll also add a little to that. We've seen the FTC start cracking down on some developers of AI tools across different industries for over-promising and under-delivering what their algorithms can do. AI is such a hot buzzword right now, and it's such a marketable term that we're starting to see the government crack down a little bit on some of the promises these tools are making. So I guess for point one, just resist the urge to try to adopt as many of these systems as you can in the sake of efficiency or the sake of cost savings without really really doing the analysis of whether this product is actually going to work for you, whether the cost makes sense, and whether it can actually deliver in compared to what its marketing language might be.
Yeah, and so we should also look to, sorry, could you go back a slide? Because we're still kind of on this. You know, identifying the key stakeholders is important, but if you take the time to develop an AI policy, that's really where you outline not necessarily identifying products to bring into your practice, but also how are your fellow physicians or your staff utilizing tools. As some of you might know, Microsoft has something called Copilot, which has a chatbot, and you can either go onto Microsoft's free chatbot, or you can be logged in with your credentials. And so having a policy that either restricts or requires your staff to make sure that they're logged into the right location of Microsoft to utilize that tool is important. Similarly, and more importantly, if you have staff that are going on ChatGPT without that, the free version of it, which basically any data you enter into is now public domain, make sure that you have training and a policy that restricts that on patient data, because that could be a HIPAA violation. Next
Yeah,
slide.
and one
Oh,
thing to
sorry.
add there really quickly is just the importance of making sure everyone that's in your practice that's going to be using this tool is really limiting the information fed to these models to just the amount it needs to know to perform the task. We've run across several breaches of ChatGPT and other larger chatbots where the threat actor was just trying to get some of the prompts that the users were putting in to get insights into how they run their business, who their relationships are. So if you are plugging in sensitive PHI with people's names, that's already been a target for threat actors. And so we would encourage any acceptable use policy that you generate to really make that top of mind, limiting the data input to what you really need to perform the task and not give it anything further than that.
Okay, now we're ready for the next slide, sorry. Okay, so when if you identify an AI tool that you want to onboard, the next step is evaluation, and that needs to start at the security level. And think about any type of software that you onboard for your practice, even unrelated to AI. Hopefully you have an IT person or an IT vendor that is looking at the security stack of what that software provides. What does that mean? The data that the tool is processing needs to be protected in a certain way to make sure that, critically important, patient data is not at risk for falling into the wrong hands. And then, you know, the practical use is also just demo the products. So learn what the product can do for you and whether that does create efficiency. Mario, anything to add there?
Yeah, and I think sometimes for conducting the security analysis, some clients feel like they don't have a lot of bargaining power or leverage with some of these larger software companies and take their security representations at face value. Right now, with how many products there are out there on the market, vendors and service providers are more willing to share security information, how they protect their data, where it's stored, what mechanisms are used, because it's such a competitive space. You oftentimes are able to walk away from one solution if you're not getting the information you need and find another. So I would encourage in your talks and exploring these different tools to really ask the tough questions about security, because more often than not they're going to give you the information because they know how competitive this market is right now.
Well, that wraps up our presentation on AI in healthcare. So thank you so much for your attendance. And if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. Thank you.
Thanks.